time for a bit more of an in-depth, lengthy conversation about Elden Ring. So, the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, in my opinion, was just good. Not great, not fantastic like a lot of people pretend it is, or not pretend, like a lot of people think it is. But in this case, I want to react to Jester of Juice today and his... I forgot to do the thing. Jester of Juice, who on July of 2024 uploaded a video called There's Something Wrong with Shadow of the Erdtree. And I agree. There is something wrong. It's just really hard to put into words. The only way I can really do it right now is that a lot of it feels a bit gamey, like a little bit too video gamey. And we'll probably get more insight into that perspective as we go through.
In the days leading up to Elden Ring's initial release, me and the homie Booty Juice were consistently claiming that it would be garbage, and would never live up to the hype. We were fully under the impression that FromSoft had bitten off more than they could chew, and that their new approach to game design would be a misguided mess. Not being familiar with the crafting system, I had assumed that it would be intrusive to the main experience of the game.
I see what you're saying.
After seeing stealth utilized in a promotional preview, I thought it would be too powerful to be balanced appropriately, and I thought the same of Spirit Summons. However, within an hour of gameplay, both me and Booty Juice were completely hooked. The game released at 10 p.m. in our local time, and we were going in with the assumption that we would be attempting the first boss a couple of times and then calling it a night. And yet, me and Booty didn't put the game down until 3 in the morning. And strangely, we both independently happened to wake up and begin playing once again at 6 in the morning. The massive scale, interesting...
Bro, you woke up at 6 in the morning after you played till 3? Bro is insane. Bro and his friend are insane. I see what he's saying, though. Like, when FromSoft had never done really open worlds, I think the closest thing to it would be, like, Sekiro. It was pretty open. But even then, it had more of a Metroidvania feel to it. And I can understand what he's saying, right? From Software suddenly saying, hey, we're making a big open world with the same mechanics as Dark Souls? That sounds weird. Even knowing how Elden Ring released, that still sounds weird on the surface, right? That sounds bizarre. That sounds like it shouldn't really work. And I understand where his skepticism was coming from. I think claiming it was going to be garbage before hearing really that much more about it is a bit of a stretch. I don't think just... I mean, come on. Demon Souls to Sekiro, every game from everybody's perspective has been banger, 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 after banger. Like, they're all amazing. So even if Shadow of the Erdtree did do some things kind of... Not Shadow of the Erdtree, I'm sorry. Even if Elden Ring did do some things kind of bad or stupid, it wouldn't have been garbage. Surely. Come on, right?
Art
But I understand what he's
intrigue
saying.
built through NPC dialogue and unbridled call to adventure that saturated throughout Elden Ring's early moments.
Also, this is apparently in HD. It does not look it.
Had developed a manic excitement in us that couldn't be contained by the need for sleep. For me, this excitement lasted weeks upon weeks as I scoured the game for all of its content, yet still missing out on bits of the game that I wouldn't see for up to 2 years later.
Oh yeah, there's so much in this
game. Hitting every
game.
boss, seeing every location for the most part, every NPC quest for the most part, and eventually no-hitting the whole game 4 months later, I had no choice but to deem this masterpiece as the greatest game I've ever played.
I've never tried parrying Radagon. Huh. Usually I just kind of deemed Radagon a bit too quick to even try to parry, but I should maybe try that from now on. I parried a lot of enemies in this game. I just never really tried Radagon. I got so used to the dodge hit maneuver, I never tried it. Also, when people claim validity through their challenge runs, I usually get a bit skeptical because congratulations, hit the game, but that doesn't really say much at the end of the day. Anyone who's good at games can do challenge runs like these without actually being quote-unquote good at the game. It's usually just like memorization. Like memorizing patterns, weapon locations, what order to do things in, right? It doesn't actually say much about your moment-to-moment skill with the game when you have things memorized.
The lowest lows of the Godskin duo to the highest highs of Malekith, Morgott, Horaloo, and Mohg.
Malekith
this
again,
game was
shut
a
up.
roller coaster of investment, wonder, difficulty, and most of all, adventure. And it was accessible to more people than ever, offering a delightful experience exploring through the game, potentially to gather various pieces of overpowered equipment, which could see the more casual side of the fan base through the more difficult checkpoints of progression. But it also offered intense difficulty through the endgame bosses, many of which are considered the hardest in all of Souls. At the end of the day, there is only one word to most accurately describe Elden Ring. It is a masterpiece.
Yeah,
and I've spent the last 2 years wanting one thing more than anything else
What?
in the world.
Dude, look at this again.
A masterpiece.
The
And
third
I've spent
slam.
the last 2 years wanting one thing more than
He
anything
just
else.
dodges it again. Dude, do you know how many times I try to dodge that move and it just doesn't freaking work? I have done it dozens of times. Dodging is like, not 50-50, but maybe like 70-30 for me at this point. It just sometimes won't work. How come he gets to do it?
In the world, more Elden Ring. FromSoft's DLCs are widely known to be their best content for a variety of reasons.
Usually.
The idea that Elden Ring would someday be receiving that treatment left my mouth watering. So let's take a look at what we should have expected from an Elden Ring DLC. Firstly, there's refinement. FromSoft has an unmatched reputation for their DLCs taking what worked about the main game's content and then refining that into its most perfect form. For me, the most poignant example of this is Bloodborne, which toys with mechanics like limb crippling throughout the main game but never really seems to meet the mark in the base content. Crippleable bosses are most often comboed from one cripple into the next until the boss's health bar is drained, which is pretty underwhelming and reduces the boss to a sad, pathetic punching bag. The DLC of Bloodborne instead finds a reasonable balance between cripple staggers being useful for bits of extra damage without them overshadowing the boss entirely. Bloodwig, for example.
It's almost like, I guess as an example, if you stance broke a boss multiple times, like just straight back to back, that's kind of what it sounds like he's talking about.
Is crippleable, but you wouldn't really even have to consider that at all while fighting him. You'll be too busy worrying about the dangerous, powerful boss fight in front of you to care about a single hit of extra damage. As for Elden Ring, the mechanics that I think have the most potential for refinement would be jumpable moves, minor dungeons, stealth, and exploration.
What was that last one?
Potential for refinement would be jumpable moves, minor dungeons, stealth, and exploration.
Minor dungeons, stealth, and exploration. Exploration? Refinement? No, no, he's capping on that one. That's not. No, exploration in Elden Ring was already. I mean, unless you're talking about maybe like making the world smaller, making it a little bit more not ridiculous to find things like it is in the base game sometimes. Stealth, I mean, equip some stealth spells and things like that. I mean, I wouldn't say stealth needed much. You weren't really supposed to rely on it. It would kind of just be useful for maybe like getting through certain areas a little faster. Jumpable moves? No. No, what is he talking about? That's not even... What does that even mean? That's not... The whole problem with jumpable attacks is that the average player will never know that you can jump over attacks. The game does not tell you it. And nor has any Dark Souls game previously allowed you to jump over moves. Except for Sekiro, that doesn't even really count as a Souls game. We just kind of clump it in because it's made by FromSoft. That's... No, we didn't need more jumpable attacks. We needed a better explanation for jumpable attacks in Elden Ring. That's what we needed. Minor dungeons? I mean, in the DLC, I guess you'd expect them to be more unique than they ended up being. But I think there was only like 3 this time that ended up looking the same. I forget exactly. I could be wrong. It's been a while since I played it.
And not because these aspects need to be refined further, but more so that they could be implemented in more ways, especially jumpable moves. I think the jumpability of boss attacks was criminally underused in the main game, especially being that it increases the skill ceiling of learning a boss's moveset.
Again, that's more... It feels like an exploit. That's the problem with jumping. It feels like exploiting the game as opposed to learning it. Because when you jump over attack for the first time, you're like, that makes no sense. And, you know, technically dodging doesn't make sense either, but at least it's a mechanic they tell you how to use. Jumping is meant more as like a traversal thing, or like implementing jump attacks. But in Elden Ring's case, why would we need more of that? Because I beat Elden Ring multiple times without even realizing jumping was a viable thing. Especially when you jump over thrust attacks. Like, Rolana in the DLC has a thrust attack you could jump over. It looks like the most ridiculous thing ever. You would never suspect that you could jump over it. Because it looks ridiculous. It's almost like those scenes in cartoons where, like... Or actually any movie, really. Where, like, the character... Let me full screen for this one. Where the character leaps over something, and, like, the thing they're jumping over barely misses their crotch. That's what jumping over these attacks honestly feels like. It makes no sense to do it multiple times. It looks weird.
Oralu is about the only main fight that appropriately implements this feature, and he stands out in such a unique way for it. Now, one thing that seems to be a prominent idea within FromSoft's DLCs is their increase in difficulty, which I would consider an aspect of refinement more so than a focus on difficulty itself. Soulsborne DLCs will generally only be accessible from the end game or after beating a final boss, which sets them to be balanced against the game's soft and hard stat caps in a simple way. The DLC bosses are usually not going to be pushovers health-wise, and due to that, they have to have fully fleshed out and complex movesets. Their difficulty comes from pitting you against an enemy that, best case scenario, you'll still have to deal with for a good chunk of time, while avoiding a complex moveset with a diverse assortment of timings and AoEs that you'll have to mentally account for and time well in the moment while utilizing good positioning skills.
In the moment. Keyword there, in the moment.
In short, a so-called difficult DLC boss is just a well-designed boss with a big enough health bar to justify its position in the endgame, just as ideally
and being faster. That being a faster boss is not a bad thing by default. It's how it's executed and why. So like in Dark Souls 1, for example, the DLC did it really well because you are often way faster than the enemies. Like, in Dark Souls 1, believe it or not, you're actually a bit faster than in Dark Souls 3. I know that sounds weird just because you control better in Dark Souls 3, but in Dark Souls 1, when you roll, or when you swing and then you roll, you actually have a smaller window to wait between attacking and rolling. So you can inch out attacks a little bit faster, a little more efficiently. So, but how many bosses really take advantage of that? Like, maybe Orsti and Smo sometimes. I can't really think of many enemies that are fast enough for that to even matter. So when the DLC comes around, Artorias and Manus are very much better about utilizing your moveset. It's not so much making like super hard bosses, it's about making the better bosses for your moveset. So now it's almost like the bosses are matching your speed as opposed to surpassing it and expecting you to memorize everything about them, right? Now, in the case of Artorias, there are things you'll have to memorize, like his pocket sand, his pocket sand thing, right? Where he's kind of like just surprises you with like a sand attack, almost. That's what it looks like. He's like throwing dirt in your eye. I'll put some dirt in your eye. And like memorizing the Q up for Manus' combo attack, which you won't survive depending on your armor set. But, and Dark Souls 2 also kind of did this with its bosses. It maximized how good you could be versus a boss. The bosses were just fast enough to utilize Dark Souls 2's very slow moveset. It's much slower than any of the Souls games to date, even now. Dark Souls 2 is very slow, and did that for this reason. The Dark Souls 3 is almost as fast as Dark Souls 1 as far as your character responding to things, but you also have more iframes by default. You have more weapons, although not as many of them are as viable. But, things like that. The speed of those bosses matched you very well by the end game. Although I will admit, sometimes Sister Fried could be a bit more memorization than reaction time, but he'll probably talk about that here. I'm going to spend way too long talking about nonsense. I'm only 4 minutes into this 1 hour long video, and I am already 13 minutes into this recording.
An easy boss would be a well-designed boss with a small health bar positioned in the early game, such as Margit. This point will be relevant to my analysis soon enough, so keep it in mind. So what else should we have expected from an Elden Ring DLC? Well, in a perfect world, the DLC would find a way to recapture the excitement of the explorative aspects of Elden Ring, either through offering so much new and useful loot and fresh challenges littered throughout the world that you'll...
It does do that. I think if one thing the DLC brought with it, a lot of cool loot, a lot of cool new weapons, new spells, new just like Ashes of War, things to play around with. It did do that really well. And there are challenges sprinkled throughout the world, however justified you might think they are.
Naturally be inclined to explore, or by piggybacking off of the base game, and offering a synergy between the lands between and the Realm of Shadow that would allow easy access between realms. This would offer you an enriched new game run of Elden Ring, and allow you to plan the run of your playthrough that weaves through the new and old content, picking up items and abilities in one of the areas that would enhance your experience through the other, creating a synergy between them.
I see what he's saying, and it's not a bad idea. I think that may be expecting a bit much, though. That's a really difficult thing to pull off, especially for Elden Ring. Weaving the progression between the two, no, I think that's a bit much. I think asking for that is a bit much. Granted, it's not like how they executed it was perfect, but I think expecting that kind of balance, not the wisest of moves. At least they lock it off behind a relatively difficult boss. So it's not like you can just jump in there and get your face destroyed immediately.
Fortunately, we knew going in that the DLC would require beating Moog, which, sure, can be done early enough, but odds are you're going to have a full build before entering the DLC. Yes. So our only hope is that the DLC's exploration can stand on its own. Another aspect we should expect from the DLC is...
Well, kind of. It kind of does. Sort of. The new loot it introduces is cool. What you're actually finding where, he'll probably get into that. I'm talking too much for a prelude. I'm talking too much for a build up. I need to shut up for a minute.
Immense replayability. I've played Elden Ring over 100 times through, and I can't say I've quite gotten bored of it yet. There's always a new challenge run to try or a new weapon to start a playthrough with. It would be hard to imagine a FromSoft DLC that lacks replayability. And lastly, I expect the DLC to feature fantastic lore. This game is filled to the brim with unanswered questions and unfinished plot points.
Lore. I can't say I give a crap about lore because it doesn't really affect what I'm doing. Like, man, I don't care what this guy did. I'm going to kill him regardless. This is not like a choice-based RPG where, oh, you can choose to sympathize with the character. No, I'm murdering everything. I am killing everyone in my path. I don't care what their story was because it's not relevant to my character. I'm not here because this person did a thing. I mean, maybe I am to an extent, but I'm not, my character does not relate to the other characters at all. Zero. I am a menace that just shows up and kills everything. The lore is fine, but, I don't understand why people put so much importance on it when the gameplay does not hinder on it hardly at all. It's literally dialogue. That's it. If some of these bosses had no dialogue, nothing would change. They just have it there to give you story. And to be quite frank, I don't remember, a single line from anybody except for, Melania. And I've never known to defeat you and all that crap. And that's only because you've died over so many times. I'm sorry.
And who wouldn't expect the DLC to regale us with fresh stories that enrich the main lore of the Lands Between? And so, that's what I expected going into this DLC. And I don't think that I was necessarily overestimating what FromSoft could deliver.
I think you are. I think you definitely are a little bit. That's a pretty lengthy list of things for them to get done right. Okay, if they got most of that, sure, right? Okay, that's really good still. That's still a really good DLC. I can't remember how many things he just listed off, but let's say it was 7. Let's say he just listed off 7 things. If they only got 2 of those wrong, I think no one would care. Everyone would be like, holy crap, this is amazing. Sure, there's a thing bad here, but oh my gosh, this is the best DLC ever. But he's kind of expecting them to do everything perfectly. I don't think that was I think, as much as Shadow of the Erdtree suffers sometimes, I think he's expecting a bit much going into it. I didn't know what to expect, to be quite frank. I had no clue what to expect.
Yet to let me down in their modern games, and my personal philosophy about their game design is that they keep getting better and better. And that's not to mention the 2.5 years that it took to deliver this content.
No, it didn't. In that 2.5 years, they were patching Elden Ring, fixing the PC port, balancing it, making Armored Core, and making the DLC. And probably planning for the next project as well. I think the fact alone that they made Armored Core after Elden Ring should say enough about the fact that this take is not very good. They did not have 2.5 years to make Shadow of the Erdtree. They had 2.5 years to fix Elden Ring, balance it, make Armored Core, and make the DLC. You've really, really, really got to take that into account here, dude. That's a big point. That's a big point.
So let's take a look at what we got. This DLC was so bad, it made me touch grass. And I'm not even joking.
Okay. No, it wasn't that bad. Okay. I just realized how I sounded. No, it was not so bad that I wanted to go out and touch grass.
Say that. I took a week off work to play this content, hoping to cram as much game time as possible into that period before financial obligations forced me away. I waited until 10 p.m. when the DLC released, fully planning on playing all night. Yet instead, I played for a couple of hours, tried Relana for a bit, and then called it a night. I slept in, returned to the game.
That's about how I did. I think Rolanda kind of is the thing that made me stop in my tracks. Yeah, because I got to Rolanda, even though I think you're supposed to get to the Divine Beast first, technically speaking. Which I guess isn't wrong, because there's a giant tunnel and staircase that, like, leads you right to it, but... 50-50.
Beat Rolana, and then took on the Tower of Ballarat area. And after realizing he returned to the game of hours, tried Rolana for a bit, and then called it a night. I slept in, returned to the game, beat Rolana, and then took on the Tower of Ballarat area. And after realizing that this boss feels like absolute shit, featuring such a simplistic design that telegraphs could only be unnatural and frustrating, I took a break.
Thank you. Finally, someone said, I don't understand what people see in the Divine Beast. I don't get it. He doesn't look any different between the attacks he's doing. And even the ones where you can tell, it usually doesn't have as much of a wind-up time as you would normally need to react to something. Like, the weather, the effects thing is cool, where he, like, changes between lightning, frost, more air, I guess his default attacks. But, like, his design is weird and is a terrible way to telegraph his attacks, because his design is so, like, bulky and, like, not really... Like, there's no real limbs showing at any point. It's just his mouth. It's like you have to stare at his mouth to tell what's going on. There's a net. And that's terrible design. I don't understand why people like the Divine Beast. I really don't. I'll make my own controversial Elden Ring DLC video one day, but as of right now, I'm just going to piggyback off of this guy.
Ate lunch, and then sat outside in the sun. The contrast of Elden Ring's original release filling me with such a manic excitement that I couldn't put it down, and this content, which I had to force myself to play, left me in such a state of depression over the last couple weeks. And sure, you could make the argument that I had set my expectations too high, but this is...
He did. He definitely did set his expectations too high. I think always stay a little subdued, especially in gaming nowadays. Now, I get it. It's From Software. Even with here's the thing. Even with Shadow of the Erdtree, despite the fact that this guy's expectations were too high, I still don't think they failed. They didn't fail. I think they failed in certain aspects, but I don't think as a game developer they have failed. I think they bit off a little more than they could chew. I think people were so crazed for DLC, they might have rushed it. I think they were pressured. I think they were a little bit pressured. I'll make, again, a video coming out for that someday, but I still don't think they failed. I have not lost faith in From Software just because I think they messed up on this DLC. They are still a brilliant development company. That does not change. Yes, his expectations were too high.
About. I love this game, even its shittiest parts. And so I'm left with the conclusion that this content isn't Elden Ring. It's something else. Something worse. And why is that? Well, let's start with difficulty.
How do people do that? How do you get that effect? I want that. How do you change the text on that?
It is no secret that FromSoft was attempting to up the ante with the content in Shadow of the Erdtree's difficulty. And in hindsight, that concept just seems so juvenile and such a misread of what Elden Ring was meant to be. As I've discussed before.
Exactly. Elden Ring was so difficult. How are you going to up the ante? How? How do you surpass Malenia? In fact, most bosses here kind of did surpass Malenia to an extent, in various ways, right? But, like, when you think about... Like, even I knew that ahead of time. I thought, man, Elden Ring was so difficult, I, like, hated it for a while. I hated it, and I do still hate some bosses, but... Like, even beforehand, I knew, like, this is either going to be the most infuriating thing ever, or it's going to be a park... It's going to be a park on the walk, as only waifu likes to joke. A cakewalk, right? But I knew they wouldn't make it a cakewalk. From Software, if anything, if they had to do anything in the DLC, they could not make Shadow of the Erdtree a cakewalk. That was the one thing that they absolutely must do, is not make it easy. So it had to be harder. And, well, we got that. But how do you make Elden Ring harder? How? It was min-maxing you hard enough as it was.
In my Elden Ring analysis videos, Elden Ring is both the hardest and easiest Souls game.
I've heard that a lot.
Depending on how meta your build is and how much time you want to put into it. Yeah. Almost every single boss and mini-boss in Elden Ring is much more complex than any boss in prior games, which means a low-damage build will make even a mini-boss a difficult challenge to overcome. As well as that, you're given more freedom than ever to build an overpowered build earlier than ever before, which means even a complex endgame boss can be made incredibly easy. People fucking love this aspect of Elden Ring, especially considering the large influx of more casual players due to Elden Ring's mainstream success.
Gosh, all that rolling he had to do to get one hit on this thing. Jeez. And I don't even light roll the majority of the time. This guy's light rolling.
Your Great Shields, Azure Comet, Mugwin's Sacred Spear, Spirit Summons, they're all beloved by a large portion of the fan base specifically because they make the game easier. So why the fuck would the focus of the new content be to make the game more difficult at all costs? Especially so when extremely...
Because if they didn't make it more difficult, the fan base would have rioted. They would have rioted. They would have gone insane, hysterical. They would have gone over the deep end, complaining about it if it was not harder. Heck, even if it was as hard as base game, some people probably still would have been disappointed. It was not a simple thing to make. That's why I don't suddenly dislike From Software more just because of this DLC, right? Like, no, they're still great developers, but man, they were put in a really tough spot with this DLC. You have to empathize a little bit. Like, come on.
Cheesy, overpowered shit is locked behind the DLC, and let me tell you, there was certainly a cost to this design choice. Let's stop beating around the bush here. The final boss of this DLC is one of the most pathetic attempts at artificially inflating the difficulty.
Yes, now this was made in July. This was before they nerfed him again. However, I think this was after their first nerf. July 11th. When did the DLC actually come out? Hang on. PlayStation and Xbox, it came out on the 20th. Okay, so this came out June 20th. Yes, so this was after the first nerf, but not before the second most recent nerf. And the second most recent nerf, perfect. As far as keeping all of his actual moves intact, perfect. Leave it as is, we're good. So, yes, even after the first nerf though, now I heard from some content creators that like before the first nerf, Radon was basically like literally impossible. Like, not literally, but even compared to his first nerf, like, pretty much like a complete joke, like, spit in your face challenge. Now, he's talking about after the first nerf, and I beat him after the first nerf, but man, it took forever. I learned his parry windows, man, and everything, man. I whipped out every cheesy strat I could find without directly looking up how to beat him, and I did it, and I eventually beat him myself melee only, but man, this, ridiculous.
Of a boss.
Also, why is this part called Millennia and not Radon?
That I've ever seen, in an implementation that I've dubbed the waterfowl problem. Now, I've been vocally critical against Millennia's waterfowl move for years now.
Everyone
Long
is.
Story short, Millennia's waterfowl is undodgeable. And I already know what you're thinking because I've heard it all a million times before. Yes, you can dodge waterfowl by exploiting her tracking. Yes, you can dodge her first burst with Bloodhound Step. Yes, you can subvert the move with an Ice Pot. What I mean when I say undodgeable...
Yeah, but that feels like exploiting, just like jumping attacks, right? That feels like, it's almost like you found a loophole in the contract, right? That's what it feels like. When you learn the phrase pot method, which is my go-to method at this point, it feels like you're cheating. It feels like you're cheating. And I don't think that is a valid excuse to excuse an entire move that otherwise will kill you. It will kill you. You cannot dodge it. You can out-tank it, but if you want to keep light roll, it will kill you. So... I agree with this guy. That's not really an excuse. That's kind of, it's good that it's there. That's a good thing. Trust me. I'm glad that is there. I'm glad you can exploit her tracking. I'm glad Bloodhound Step is a thing. I'm glad you can freeze pot her while she's trying to do it. But that's not an excuse for how bad the move actually is. I don't think anyone's actually debating that that's a bad move. At least I hope not, because, you know, like, duh. Of course it is. But that's not really, the rest of her moveset is good. That's kind of what's painful about it.
Dodgeable is that there was no developer-intended way to dodge this move. There is no way in hell that FromSoft expected players to do a full 360 around her in order to throw the move off.
Yeah.
Which can only leave us with the conclusion that FromSoft...
Same thing with jumping over thrust attacks. It looks so ridiculous that you would never expect that it could even be jumped over in the first place. The spear will, like, go through, like, your lower abdomen, and it'll count as a dodge when you jump it. And you just sit there like, how was I supposed to know that? That's stupid. It doesn't feel developer intended, but it is, I guess. Sure, we'll go with that.
Didn't have an answer to waterfowl while designing it. They simply expected players to find a way around it. Now, don't get me wrong, I completely understand that gamers will absolutely find a way around an obstacle no matter what. But designing a move without also having an answer for that move is undoubtedly sloppy craftsmanship.
It is,
why
for sure.
I call Millennia an artificially difficult boss. If we allow this kind of design...
Yeah, I mean, again, no one's really debating that, right? That's... We know Malenia is cheap, but that's almost part of why she's kind of fun to fight in a weird way.
Without criticizing it.
And there's the thing, she was the only boss in base game that was like that. Well, another one in my opinion, maybe two, but aside from that, she was like the only like remembrance really big one that was 100% objectively speaking had an unfair advantage over you. So with that in mind, one boss being unfair, I mean, come on. No one really cares, right? One boss, come on.
Then we're essentially saying that sloppy, lazy design is the same as difficult design. Taking this concept to its ultimate form, what if there was a boss that filled their arena with an AoE that lasted 5 seconds? And the only answer we came up with was to glitch through the fog wall with a specific Ash of War, wait out the attack, and then glitch back in. Sure, a boss fight that you have to carefully position yourself nearby the fog wall while fighting so as to perform this glitch would be difficult.
Yeah.
But if you wouldn't also call it stupid bullshit, then you're not a very serious person. The bottom line for me is that every single move in the game should be avoidable by either dodging, jumping, crouching, or sprinting. The basic abilities your character has, and they should all be designed with developer-intended methods of avoiding in mind. Now, you might be able to excuse Waterfowl because technically you can dodge her move with basic abilities through the spin method. However, Radahn the Promised Consort is even worse than that.
And again, Malenia is the only one in base game that's really like this at all, so you know, it's whatever.
Most pathetically simple way. Radahn has access to a move in his basic moveset that is undodgeable. A roll catch positioned directly after a correctly rolled move. I will not mince my words here. This is fucking stupid design. I feel like I should elaborate.
They did nerf this attack, and it can now be dodged normally. However, it did take them quite a while to do it, so we are going to take this criticism as just as serious as if they didn't do it.
Two swings have nearly perfect tracking. The attack is his fastest move. The second swing has twice the reach of a single roll. The only way to avoid both of these moves is to use exploits. So let's list the ones that don't work. You cannot roll in any specific direction. The tracking is too aggressive.
Well, some people have said you can roll like really hard against his right leg, or I guess... Wait. I think you have to dodge into his right leg, like this one right here, because that's where the blade comes from. If you're light rolling and do that, I think you could dodge it. A lot of people have been saying that, so you could, but a lot of people also said that it's really stupid to expect, like, oh, you have to roll at this exact split-second moment in this exact direction perfectly. That's stupid.
You cannot roll in any specific direction. The tracking is too aggressive. You cannot crouch or jump this move. You cannot bloodhound step out of this move.
You cannot
low profile with the bear claw, which is the lowest your hitbox can get as far as I'm aware. So what can you do? You can use the blind spot Ash of War available on backhand blades, which is what I utilized in my no-hit. This will only work if you're positioned close enough, so it's not consistent. You can parry it, fair enough. I personally...
Wait, you can? I didn't parry it. I tried to parry it multiple times. You can? I tried to parry it multiple times. Huh. Yeah, I guess I just didn't hit it right. Okay.
Have a soft spot for parrying, but it still comes out incredibly quickly, and not everyone is going to want to parry. The last option is to utilize one of the new talismans added in the DLC, which gives you iframes on backsteps. Backstepping is quick enough so that you'll have time to roll the second attack. This is probably the most consistent option, but for one thing, requires knowledge of the talisman itself, which I didn't know existed for a...
Exactly, that's actually a complaint I have against base game Elden Ring even, right? Like, man, how the crap are you supposed to know where things are at? It's stupid. You should not be expected to look things up. There should be a developer-intended way behind everything. Don't assume everybody has internet, because I guarantee you a lot of people play this game without internet.
Long time, which left me to bash my head against the poor design of this boss for hours upon hours. And again, I highly doubt that this was the developer-intended method to avoid this move. FromSoft's development style seems to have taken on the attitude of just throw enough shit at the players, both good and bad, they'll figure it out. And this argument might make me sound elitist, but when it comes to Souls games, the reason they stand above the rest is because they're supposed to be precise. If you take damage, it's supposed to be your fault for not dodging, not your fault for not knowing a very specific and niche ability exists somewhere in the game. And if the design...
And heck, even if Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3 did this, it would not be nearly as bad as Elden Ring, because Elden Ring is an open world, and it's freaking massive. Again, that's my problem with base game, and in this case, it's actually even worse than the DLC, but in base game, you think, okay, well, freeze pots can stop this. I don't have the crafting book for freeze pots. And it's like, well, okay, now where do you find that? Oh, I don't know. Go find it, idiot. Look it up. Of course, I guess if you knew about the pot method beforehand, you have internet, but you get my point. You get my point. Shut up.
Philosophy has degraded to a point at which players continue to get more and more powerful abilities and bosses get harder and harder to compensate. Well, pretty soon, Souls games will start to look like some normie shit like Skyrim, where you just wail on an enemy while they wail on you. And that might seem far-fetched, but what have players most often been beating Radahn with?
Great shields.
A great shield and spear combo. The horseshoe theory has made itself clear here. If you make the boss so difficult, then the standard way to beat them will be to use the easiest method possible.
Yes.
And in turn, the game becomes you and the boss wailing on each other.
That could, the same thing can be argued with Dark Souls 1's Ceaseless Discharge. Who actually fights the guy legit? His hitboxes are so ridiculously bad that no matter how overpowered I get, I can never bring myself to fight him normally because, man, why would you? It's so stupid. And, like, not even a shield will save you, I don't think, if I remember correctly. But, like, I just don't want to bother with those god-awful hitboxes. Terrible hitboxes. Like, they just straight up can't be dodged just sometimes if you get unlucky enough, right? I resort to just running away from him first. And he's got a pretty decent amount of health, too, so that often isn't great. So, I guess same thing here. And again, Millennia was the only boss in base game that did things like this. And it was just one move, so.
What
I've actually never tried the Great Shield Spear. I did do Great Shield, just not with the spear. Because I thought he did enough, he did enough stamina damage to make it to where constantly trying to do that wasn't super reliable. I guess they're using that one talisman, or that one, hard tier deflect physic.
fucking embarrassing joke, and I've only mentioned a single one of his moves. He also has a move that seems to cut through your iframes. Might be a glitch, not sure what that's about. He also has the worst hitbox on a thrust move that I've seen in a while. In his Blood Flame
that
attack,
one's pretty bad.
you will be hit by this unless you dodge first, which is pretty sad. It's a thrust move. Mesmer has some pretty aggressive tracking on his thrust moves, and even they're strafable because they're fucking thrust moves. And last but certainly not least, he has a pathetic way of increasing his difficulty in Phase 2 with these ridiculous AoE follow-ups.
Yeah, that one was
I
pretty bad.
honestly thought that this fight
That was nerfed to be smaller. I think it lasts the same amount of time, but it shrunk down. It's smaller now, so. But still, it took him a while, so this criticism is still perfectly valid.
It was a sloppy fan-made mod when I first saw it. You know how the Millennia the Unalloyed mod just adds a bunch of holy follow-ups on each of her attacks because it's cheap and easy to copy-paste assets onto each of her existing moves. It's really fucking disappointing that Radahn got this treatment in the DLC. He's such an awesome fan-favorite character. Getting hypnotized by a sexy femboy, I can understand that part. But giving Radahn a send-off with this bad of a boss fight is really disrespectful and sad.
I don't know about disrespectful and sad. That sounds like you're kind of looking at it the wrong way. It's like, man, this was peak Radahn. He was this powerful. But and if anything, he's in Mohg's body, so maybe he could have been even more powerful, right? So I don't... He's not wrong, but he's not right either. It's kind of like, oh, this was his send-off. It's like, bro, he is literally the hardest boss in the game. What do you mean this is his send-off? Like, I don't know what more you really want in a send-off for a boss to be honest. What, do you want him to be weaker than his weakened form? That doesn't make any sense. I don't know.
I no-hit every single Remembrance fight in this DLC, and I can say with certainty that some of them are awkward, some of them are annoying, but Radahn is the only one that is completely broken. And even with whatever exploit you choose to use to avoid his broken moves, you still need to be able to identify them, which are his fastest moves, and then implement your exploit before you get fucked. The bottom line is, you are not no-hitting Radahn without a heavy prescription of Adderall. I only managed to do it after chugging 600 milligrams of caffeine on an empty stomach. And when the dust settles, the fight is over, and you're met with the silence of the end of the Shadow of the Erdtree.
Also, congratulations, no-hitting. I'm watching this footage, I'm like, man, this guy's good. Congratulations, Mr. Jester of Juice. Congratulations. For once, you are a challenge runner that is bashing the difficulty instead of supporting it.
Realize that your last moments with this...
I'm sorry, I could be wrong. I shouldn't have said that. I could be wrong. I'm sorry. I don't actually follow challenge runners all that much, so I could be wrong. I'm sorry. I'm not going to assume every challenge runner says that, but I have seen a lot of people say that on Reddit, so...
graphics content are spent in a lazy, sloppy boss fight. Now before I move on, there's two aspects of this boss fight that are more of an overarching problem with the DLC's design as a whole: camera issues and jumpable moves. First of all, if you're going to design a boss fight with incredibly fast moves and subtle telegraphs, can you at least have the camera system functioning remotely well enough to actually see those telegraphs? There are camera issues throughout this whole DLC.
Actually, I don't think the camera in Radon was that bad. It was not the camera. It was the amount of crap on the screen that would have been helped by the camera, but they should have just removed the crap off the screen. In fact, they even did this in the most recent nerf where they toned down the light effects on some moves. But I'm talking like how big his freaking cape is, how it gets in the way, how big Mikkela's hair is. It's like, it's ridiculous. The camera itself isn't as much of a problem as how much crap is shoved onto the camera at any given point in time. So
DLC, which is incredibly sad considering Elden Ring's base game has almost zero camera issues on even its fastest bosses. It reeks of rushed development that even the basic combat features are this rough around the edges. Radon specifically forces you to learn the fight at a close proximity to him so as to avoid the dumbass holy explosion bonus projectiles. And yet, if Radon is to bend over while you're too close to him, the camera won't catch up by the time he stands up, and his next attack will have a mostly obscured telegraph. I mean, just look how frantic the camera feels in these clips. It can't decide whether or not it wants to look directly up or directly down, and meanwhile, I'm supposed to dodge as though I have accurate visual information and positioning skills when my dodges are being thrown all over the place. Now lastly, I feel as though I should mention that Radon does have a jumpable move, which is the Earth Shatter Stomp, which references Godfrey, who he idolized. However, this fight has absolutely no synergy with jumping in any way. You can jump the Earth Shatter if you want, which might be a smart idea considering the camera is likely to drag you into the lingering part of the attack if you're attempting to dodge past it, but you're not really going to get a jump attack in at that point unless you're using a very fast weapon, and you likely have more pressing issues at that point than a single small...
Okay, so I guess I'm just bad because I have also tried, just like I've tried to parry that one really fast move, I've also tried to jump the Earth Shatter, and it just didn't work. I do it against Godfrey all the time, and it's fun to do it against Godfrey, but I've tried it against the Earth Shatter on Radon. I've never been able to jump it. I've tried multiple times. Am I wrong? Am I bad? Do I have to go back and try this again? Like, he no-hit, so I'll take his word for it.
Hit of damage. The reason that Hoarlu's jumpable attacks are so well designed is that they're punishing if you attempt to roll them, they offer you a reasonable opening for a jump attack, and the upgraded variant in his phase 1.5 and 2.5, which spans the whole arena, becomes less punishing if you're already used to jumping them, because you'll have trained yourself to engage with the moves through timings.
Again, but how in the crap did you even know that jumping had iframes on it? How? Where did you get this information from? Someone jumped by accident one time, found that it had iframes, and then on a move that they accidentally jumped instead of dodged, and then they posted it on Reddit. I don't know. That's a made-up story. Nonsense. But he's still right. But I actually think he's wrong in a different respect. You can still dodge it. That's the ticket. You are rewarded for learning how to jump. However, you don't have to jump. You can still dodge it. It's a bit tighter to dodge, and you do have to be a little bit closer to him, but you can do it. That's the big ticket difference, I think, between the jumping and the rolling. You should be rewarded for learning how to jump it, and nothing bad happens if you just dodge it. You just kind of have to wait a little bit longer for your next opening. I think that's why Godfrey did it well. I love Godfrey. I just hate Hoarlu.
Rather than simply avoiding the moves with positioning. There is a distinct learning curve which offers you great benefits if you learn to jump these attacks. Copying and pasting the Earth Shatter here offers no more than a reference and doesn't make the fight any better. The other time you'll utilize jumping in this fight is to avoid his gravity meatballs by sprinting and then jumping, which yeets you out of the range of the attack. I would say that this is the most standard version of a jumpable boss move throughout the DLC. On most moves you'll find yourself jumping.
I have never jumped away from them. I sprint a direction so that the ones that are farthest away from me horizontally will miss me completely, and the ones that are close enough to me, I dodge just before they hit, and I can usually pretty consistently dodge them all. But again, having to do it so pin perfectly is not good design. Not good design.
It's not in an effort to engage with the boss, it's more so that the move's timing is so tight that your best, or sometimes only odds, involves committing to throwing yourself as far as you can outside of the range of the attack. which I see as, once again, pathetic game design. Like, great
Agreed.
job designing bosses that are so hard that my only recourse is to disengage entirely with every ability at my disposal. It really gives a great flow to the combat. Anyway, I'm going to quickly go over all of the Remembrance bosses under this section about difficulty, because they're all cranked up to be as difficult as possible, even when they shouldn't be. Let's start with Rellana. The worst part about Rennala is that she's difficult, but also directly blocking you from the rest of the content in the DLC. Sure, there is a side path which allows you to reach the Blue Flower area and the Scadu Altis without fighting her, but the game is clearly telling you, based on its geography, that you should really clear Castle Ensis before continuing. And the problem with making Rellana somewhat of a skill check is that she really isn't all that complex once you know her fight well. She essentially has one small opening after each of her combos, which means you're just going to spend the fight back-rolling everything until you get your opening. I found myself dodging away after each of these small openings in an effort to avoid her near-instant proximity punishes. However, if she were to do Millennia's...
Now, my problem with Rellana isn't so much her skill check vibe, because even Morgott was a skill check. But at the same time, it wasn't blocking you from all the content. You could get around. But anyways, aside from that, my problem with Rellana is that all of her moves look the exact same. She just swings a sword, and that's it. They don't really look unique. It's just swinging a sword over and over and over again. And you're supposed to just brute force memorize those attacks, I guess, because how else are you supposed to? And she attacks so fast that there's no real reacting to her moves. You just have to memorize them. It's the same issue I have with Hoarah, where he just flails his fist and foot everywhere, and it's so fast that you often can't really memorize it until you die to it 50 million bajillion times. It's not reacting, it's just memorizing. Rellana is worse, though, because she kills you faster. No, okay, I take it back. Not faster. She kills you fast, and she's got more moves, and she's got more, what I like to call flinch frame attacks, where you have, like, only a millisecond to determine what the move is and react to it in time. So, Rellana's moveset just looking the same all across the board, with, like, just the magic being an exception, gets on my nerves really bad.
Dashing away move before entering a combo, your back roll will be cucked by the camera and send you directly into her combo. This reduces your openings even further unless you're capable of eating her quick punishes, which again, feels super sloppy. After learning this fight, it reduces to back rolling, then waiting out her combos, then hitting her for a small amount of damage, especially considering your lack of Scadu.
You can just walk around that.
Tree fragments at that point. Parrying helps to supplement your openings, but at the end of the day, Rellana is a mostly simple endurance match. And I'm not saying that she's a bad fight at all, she's just clearly what should have been a mini-boss. I mean, let's just look at the facts here. She's a very simple knight enemy with two very simple swords. She has no speaking lines, no cutscenes, no face, and essentially amounts to a horseless Loretta with a less specialized weapon. And if it weren't for her moon move, you would assume that she's Karian related, but you would never guess that she's Renala's sister. And you might be thinking that her weapons are more than just...
Well, her name's Rellana, and Rennala is Rennala. You'd have to assume they're related to some extent, right?
Simple, the two Ashes of War she can utilize make her much more than just a mini-boss. Well, to that, I would counter with the Godskin Apostle's Black Flame Tornado, the Bell-Bearing Hunter's Marias Executioner Sword combo, and the Crucible Knight's various aspect of the Crucible abilities. Rellana would have worked well as several mini-bosses scattered throughout the DLC, but as a difficult Remembrance fight, she's just exhausting, and I like her less and less the more I fight her. And I feel like I should mention how boring her boss arena and legacy dungeon is. Her whole castle feels a lot less like a castle and a lot more like a single wall keeping you from Altis. And her boss arena has very little personality. It's cool.
Watch this crap. Wait, what?
That it's open to the sky. So
what? You can dodge it? Do you know how many times I have tried to dodge the Moonblast? Do you realize how long I thought that you were forced to jump over it? What the crap? I have tried these things so many times. Why is he able to pull them off and I can't? Admittedly, I was mid-rolling, but like... Who cares? It's a dodge. You should be able to dodge a dodgeable attack. Regardless of light or medium roll. You should be able to dodge a move. That's such crap. I have dodged that move so many times and failed. I'd always get hit by it. But then the third one I could dodge. I'm not mad at Jester. I'm mad at the game. I'm mad at the game. I'm mad at the game. It's not a skill issue. I'm telling you. I have dodged it pin perfectly with a medium roll. I have dodged it almost pin perfectly. I just assumed, oh, you just have to jump over it. I guess. That's... I'm just forced to jump it. I thought that was actually how it worked. I'm so mad. That makes me actually angry. I'm actually mad about that.
She can see the moon or whatever, if the Shadow Realm even has a moon. And I like that rain can come down in the middle of fighting her, but let's just call a duck here. It's just a square courtyard. Moving on, the Divine Beast Dancing Lion gets a cutscene and feels a bit more like a real remembrance fight. A shitty remembrance fight, but a remembrance fight nonetheless. It is ironic, though, that there is a mini-boss version of it placed in the ruins of Rulk or whatever. The major failure of this boss is that it has no limbs or weapons, and so telegraphs are absolutely going to feel unnatural. And learning this boss will feel very frustrating. The difference between a movement and an attack will largely be arbitrary for a while until you get a real grasp on the fight. And then you hit phase 2, and the boss will entirely rely on AoEs for difficulty. Much like Radahn, each of the lion's moves will get an additional attack thrown in based on the weather variant the lion has at the time. And this functions great if your vision of design was to make this fight as unengaging as possible. You'll spend most of this fight running away from attacks so as to separate yourself from the secondary effects as much as possible, which again results in the sprint jump method rearing its boring head. And this leaves the arena to be far too small for a fight like this, which again is just a boring box arena with no personality.
The camera's awful.
You'll often barely avoid an attack by the skin of your teeth, only to be pressed against the arena wall, screwing your camera and obscuring the telegraph of the next move. This fight is actual garbage, and I'd be surprised to hear anyone say a single good thing about it aside.
Everyone loves it! Everyone loves this fight! I have no clue why. Absolutely no clue why. Cool, the weather thing is kinda cool in concept, but like, that's it. That's literally the only good thing about this fight, is a concept of it. I don't understand why people like this fight. No telegraphing, like he said. The camera's awful. And to be honest, I usually end up tanking a lot of his second phase attacks at this point anyways. I don't even memorize them at this point. I summon. Like, once I beat the DLC melee only by myself, no summoning or anything, I was done. That was it. I was never going to do it again. I cheese everything as hard as I can going back in through there, because I do not enjoy most of the fights in this game. Or the DLC, I mean.
From aesthetics. Next, let's take apart Commander Gaius, which should be pretty easy considering everyone pretty much hates him. The obvious criticism is his charge attack, which has a...
The weird thing about Commander Gaius for me, I call him Commander Gaius as a joke, but Commander Gaius, I beat him easily the first 2 times I fought him. He was easy. I don't know why. Don't ask why. I have no clue what would change. The only difference was that I was using a Faith build on the first one, and I summoned. That was probably a big part of it. I don't know what I did the second time. I kind of forgot. I think I just still melee summoned. But then the third time I fought him, and every time after that, he's like this complete bullcrap, unfair piece of trash. I have no clue what happened. I don't know. Don't even ask me. I don't even know. It's kind of funny that he even has a funny story associated with him. But
ridiculously small window of error if you're dodging through it. Can be sprint jumped away from, but often comes at you with little warning and therefore little opportunity to respond, and offers no engaging gameplay after successfully avoiding. I would say the same of his Phase 2 intro move, which triggers a big gravity AoE, which is reused by Radahn, and his gravity thrust, and to an extent his gravitational missile, all of which will cause a considerable amount of disengagement in the fight and offer nothing in return. This was the only fight I found it necessary to use Bloodhound's Step on, which dramatically increased my odds against his charge attack, which you'll see about 25 times a fight. Yeah, this fight is pretty strange, and it doesn't really seem to fit in anywhere except the lore. He's a commander, but he doesn't command anyone. He's guarding this backyard area of the castle, but it doesn't lead anywhere. You just get 5 Scadu fragments and a
which is a good reward.
His remembrance weapon is a regular smithing stone weapon with a slotted and unslottable Ash of War, which I find pretty cool, but it is definitely strange. Also, he doesn't get his own OST, instead sharing the same battle music as Commander Niall and O'Neill. I really think that this fight should have been blocking off the hinterlands area instead of the secret emote path, which would have given it some value, but as it stands, it's just a bad optional fight with bad rewards. And again, if this dude was a better fight, he could have...
I mean, 5 Scadutree fragments is a pretty good reward. I don't know what you're talking about.
Been made into a mini-boss like the other commanders, rather than arbitrarily making him a remembrance. Now, let's take a bit of a sharp turn here and talk about Romano's Saint of the Bud. I think this fight is really well designed for the most part, and stands out as one of the lesser remembrances in being a decent fight. Could she have worked as a mini-boss? Yeah, definitely. I think she could have been like the Crucible Knights, with small differences in character models and moveset or weapons, which would make the Centaur Scorpion...
Well, no, because she's the only one of her kind, right?
Ladies an elite faction of their own, with each member acting as an individual boss. I don't think she quite meets the mark of a remembrance boss, but that's mostly due to aesthetic.
I don't really agree with that. I'm not really sure what that is coming down to. I mean, let's take a look at the mini bosses in Elden Ring, right? You've got like the Scadutree avatars, Crucible Knights. Those are only like minor bosses, not mini boss enemies. I don't know. Crucible Knights, some dragons, I guess. Like, any of these kinds of bosses make more sense for there to be multiple of them, but, like, this is an extremely aesthetically unique boss. I don't understand the concept behind the idea of making her a mini-boss. That doesn't make any... What quantifies as a mini-boss for you? She has a lot of different moves. Kind of. She has, like, the centipedes that attack you here. She has her own, like, pole blade thing that you can get later. She's got, like, the area of effect rot thing. She causes rot. It's a very unique fight. I'm not really sure where he's getting this whole idea of her being a mini-boss.
Reasons, those mainly being no speaking lines, no cutscene, square arena. And
I mean, that's not really... That's not a problem with the boss, it's a problem with FromSoft's crunch time.
Speaking of aesthetics, I'm not a big fan of the pastel coloring on her. I think the rebranding of Scarlet Rot in this bright neon color is a strange choice. And I think this boss would work much better if she were closer to a blood red color, which would give her a more grotesque, horrifying design. Like, you wouldn't be sure if she was born with her bug features or if there's some kind of gory symbiotic parasite bursting from her lower half.
Again, I don't really agree, because this is the only time Scarlet Rot looks like that. I don't really... Again, I'm not sure what his reasoning is coming from. And she's the only one of her kind, again, so... If she did look like that to start with, and then she got Scarlet powers, that would make sense. Now, if I'm not mistaken, the lore for her, she, like, was against Mesmer, and Mesmer did this to her? I forget. I've honestly already forgotten. I watched a short about it a while ago, and I've completely forgotten her story. She was the head of this church, hence the name Saint of the Bud, but I don't recall exactly what... I don't think there's anything wrong with the pink thing. I think it's just a petty, subjective complaint.
Instead, she kind of just looks like an edgy My Little Pony OC and doesn't really fit in well with the rest of the game, especially when picturing her in the base game. Her fight is pretty good, though. Next, we have the Scadutree Avatar, which is one of the coolest looking bosses in all of Soulsborne. I don't mind this fight at all, even with the weird respawn 3 times mechanic. It seems pretty comparable to an Erdtree Avatar or Ulcerated Tree Spirit, and after fighting more than a single of the Mesmer Furnace Golem enemies, I really wish the Scadutree Avatar would replace them entirely. Fighting the fire baskets is so unbearably tedious and easy. The other armored variants I was never able to kill because I never found enough hefty pots. Had they replaced them with the Scadutree Avatar, they could have even reused the respawn mechanic, making it so that every fight is with the same avatar, which regrows at various locations until you've taken them all out and you get the final kill, dropping its weapon. Yet again, I don't think this boss meets the mark of a remembrance fight, and would have been more valuable as a mini-boss reused at various points in the DLC.
I will actually agree with that one, depending on what its lore importance is. Because to be honest, I mean, you could rebrand anything to be a remembrance boss if you really wanted to, right? I mean, like, come on. Like, it's not that big of a deal to make them remembrance bosses. Again, for the lore... I mean, let's be real. The lore is basically the only thing determining whether these guys are remembrances or not.
And I'm going to say the same thing about the Putrescent Knight and Midra. Putrescent really feels like it should have been a field boss in at least one point in the game. specifically because of its Phase 2 intro move, which features tracking waves of ice fire that come at you in 3 bursts, with the last being a double wave. This attack is incredibly hard to dodge even when Bloodhound's Step is implemented, however is much easier to avoid by sprint jumping over. And due to that, it feels like a shame that Torrent isn't available for this fight. I don't believe that using Torrent for the entire fight would be all that much help to you, but specifically within this move, it would have been a nice touch to experiment with the mount.
I'm not a fan of this guy at all.
Add value to the fight if it were a mini-boss in at least 2 separate areas. Perhaps one with Torrent available and one without, in the same way that there are 2 Draconic Tree Sentinels in the base game, 1 field boss, and an optional one in Farum Azula. This pretty much stands for all of these lesser remembrance fights, but forcing them into more important positions than they actually fit into has ironically reduced their value as an asset. It obviously could vary from boss to boss, but I would argue that, say, 2 or more lesser but casual mini-boss fights offer much more gameplay than one fight that's forced to be difficult through high health and damage. FromSoft could have duplicated these fights into
I can see what he's saying to an extent. I don't agree with every boss being that way, though. I think Patricia could get away with, Okay, so these chapters on his video were auto-generated. Cat Tree Avatar. Yeah. I agree Patricia probably could have been a field boss of some kind. Again, though, lore. I don't know what all these guys are about, so...
2 or 3 mini-bosses, then divided the remembrance loot amongst them, which would easily fill up the map with valuable boss fights.
True.
Instead, the map feels largely empty except for furnace golems, base game mini-bosses or reskins, and mausoleums which only feature PvP-style fights. Now, I don't like PvP-style fights at all, and would rather skip them if that's an option. So luckily for me, I had a leveled Sacred Relic sword at my disposal. This weapon can easily clear every single one of these mausoleum fights due to their PvP design, even the notoriously difficult first battle with the Black Gale Knight. It is however very disappointing that, to me, these world set pieces all contain a fight worth cheesing. And the question becomes, where are all the mini-bosses in this DLC?
The dragons. But I actually like the PvP style fights in the mausoleums. I'm a little bit... I don't like how humanoid enemies, NPCs, cannot be stance broken. That crap annoys me. I don't like that. I don't know why they just allow an enemy to break the rules for no reason. I hate that. I hate when games do that. Aside from that, though, I like how they're all really unique. And their rewards are usually pretty cool. So I actually like those fights, even if they are unnecessarily irritating. In a lot of cases. And depending on your build.
A few minor dungeons on the map, including the new Death Knight and the hunched over dude with the circle blades. And then you have other minor dungeons like the Lamenters and Dragon Dungeon, which also just have PvP style fights. And the answer really is, all of the true mini-bosses and field bosses have been arbitrarily turned into remembrance fights for some reason. The last example of this is Midra, who at very least features a cutscene and dialogue. It's just his combat and legacy dungeon that falls short. Firstly, you have his mansion, which consists of 6 total rooms that you'll traverse in a linear path until reaching his boss room, which again is just a square room. I get that this dude has a spear running through his body, and probably doesn't need much in the way of furnishing, but what even is this room to him? A throne room without a throne? A bedroom without a bed? I get that it's kind of a nitpick, but a boss room can give so much personality to a boss, and most of these DLC remembrance fights just end up in a nondescript empty room. Anyway, Midra has 3 basic melee combos, and
I think his is the only one that especially doesn't make sense. Commander Gaius and Midra are the ones whose arenas are what are you doing here? I don't know, I think Midra is at least more would not be a mini boss or field boss because he's he seems so important. Literally Lord of Frenzied Flame. That sounds like a pretty high title.
And a handful of special moves. And I don't really think that it was necessary to make him a Lord of Frenzied Flame. Vike couldn't even manage to become that, and he was embraced by the 3 Fingers himself. Midra just rips his head off and gets to be a Lord of Frenzied Flame. It just seems kinda off to me. He really should have just been a frenzied victim of the Inquisitors and acted as a mini-boss punctuating this bare-bones area of the map. Now that covers Radahn and every boss that I don't believe deserves the title of Remembrance Boss, even if some of them are pretty good bosses.
Yeah.
Next there's Metyr, Mother of Fingers. I don't see this boss as hard, it's just really awkward. The most difficult part of its design is the proximity punish you'll you'll have to deal with after attacking an opening, of which there are many with many different timings, including a 2-hit combo that hits faster than you can roll and will punish you for being too greedy. This boss reminds me a lot of Erdtree, Daughter of the Cosmos from Bloodborne, especially within this move, which flings goo everywhere, followed by a jump slam. This move is very reminiscent of Erdtree's charge move and requires some very specific positioning and timing to avoid entirely. The goo projectiles will land in a circle around Metyr, around the same time that you'll have to prepare for the slam of the attack. The answer that I found was to first dodge underneath the boss, finding safety from the projectiles, and then dodge out to the side, making enough distance to avoid the slam. This again is super awkward, and you'll often get hit and be confused
I never
as
liked
to
this
which
boss,
bit
to be
of the
honest.
attack actually hit you. Not the worst boss in the world, but definitely not my favorite. Now
I never liked this boss at all, to be honest. I absolutely hate it.
lastly, I have the two fights that I think are actually great in their own ways. First,
Not
there's
Bale.
Bale, which I consider to be the ultimate dragon fight by a wide margin, often charging you with something the moment you enter his arena, and his openings are fairly small, considering you'll have to attempt to position yourself near his head, often involving sprinting or jumping towards him during valuable opening time, which makes ranged Ashes of War very useful to supplement positioning and camera issues. I think his over-the-top AoE design is pretty standard for an endgame dragon fight and fits nicely even when cranked up to the intensity that it is.
What? He's contradicting himself so hard. His windows are so tiny. Like, I still don't even know what his windows are. I have to brute force this fight every single time. What is he talking about? Like, it's just nothing but constant AoE after a while. And his moves are telegraphed so poorly because of the terrible camera.
I like Bale a lot, even despite the few flaws I find in his fight. The first being his straight fire attack, which seems to have some degree of physics to it, like most flame attacks in Elden Ring. The fire is attempting to find a straight path against the ground rather than just being a column of damage, which makes any bumps in the terrain send the fire slightly askew. This wouldn't be a problem if the DLC wasn't so infatuated with the idea of being super difficult. This straight fire attack is the least forgiving of any dragon straight fire that I've ever seen, and it requires decisive quick action or preventative action to avoid somewhat consistently. However, at times, there is nothing you can do if the fire's physics give you bad RNG. Your best bet is to once again begin sprinting and then jump as soon as the fire gets near you, pushing your hitbox as far away as you can manage. The other issue I find in him is, once again, the dogshit camera in this DLC.
Yeah, terrible.
The way the fight is designed.
That's the thing about Bale. Maybe his fight wouldn't be that bad if the camera wasn't so terrible. I'm convinced Divine Beast would still be pretty bad, but Bale, I don't know. Bale may actually not be that bad with the camera.
And you are supposed to be targeting Bale's head, being that his head takes more damage and is the center of most of his openings and where the lock-on point is designated. However, Bale being as aggressive as he is, he will often attack shortly after your openings and push his head past the point where your roll took place, which spins the camera all around and gives you very little control over your positioning. It's really embarrassing to have to mention that.
I will say an Ashen of War like he's using right now does seem very useful right about now.
So many times at this point in FromSoft's life. I expect much better than basic functions.
Look how freaking bright the screen is at all times. Look at this attack. Like, bro, look at that.
Much better than basic functions like the camera failing on every single fight in a modern FromSoft project. Other than that, Bale is pretty sick. It is funny, however, that Bale is technically not a Remembrance fight. All of these half-assed bosses get to claim the title of Remembrance fight so far in the DLC, yet Bale just drops his heart, which does function like a Remembrance fight at the Dragon Communion, so it basically counts.
Yeah, that is actually pretty bizarre now that I think about it. I will say, he definitely deserves Remembrance reward more than a lot of these other Remembrance bosses. I agree with that.
Great fight in this DLC is thankfully Mesmer.
Mesmer's fine. Mesmer's fine. Once you get him down, sure, he makes sense to a degree, but he does have still a lot of issues. His fire effects, actually a lot of the particle effects in the fight in general, get in your face to such a ridiculous extent that I find it inexcusable. He is very aggressive. Luckily his poise is pretty low, or his stance is pretty low. Because I hated him so much at first, but then got used to him, I often put him at like a C or a B tier, usually, because sure, he's a good fight after a while, I guess, but learning him is such a freaking hassle Same thing with a lot of the bosses in this game. It's such a hassle just to learn the boss that I can't give them the benefit of the doubt because a majority of my time fighting them was in the learning stage. So, no.
And I understand why they put him front and center in marketing. His moveset is fast, aggressive, and sometimes tricky, with a huge delay on his grab and several different flame-charged spear moves with subtly different telegraphs. I think his weakest aspect is his Phase 2, which relies far too much on him activating Serpent form, which creates a much more scripted set-piece fight. But this is only a small piece of the fight, as he'll use most of the same moves in Phase 2 as well. My only complaint with this boss is that it isn't hard enough to fully express his moveset. And this could only be relevant to me because I had collected a bunch of Scadu fragments at that point, and I was dealing some pretty significant damage. However, I wouldn't be complaining.
No, absolutely not. If you made Mesmer any harder, we would have another Radon on our hands. I'm not even joking. I'm not exaggerating. That's how hard it would be. He is plenty hard enough as is. Leave him alone. Do not make him any stronger. That's ridiculous.
If he had a full health bar Phase 2 and was more in line with Millennia. I think his place as a mid-difficult boss fight as far as the DLC goes is because he is directly preventing players from progressing in the DLC. But that's really a shame because his fight is many, many times more finely tuned and well crafted than the garbage fight he's blocking access to. I really wish that Mesmer was the true final boss of this DLC and had the difficulty reflect that, because as it stands, he's one of the only good fights in the whole DLC. And so to summarize, this whole DLC is filled to the brim.
I can't even see these snakes he's dodging. He literally had to remember this stuff. I couldn't even see that he was about to be attacked. He literally had to memorize all of these snakes, like, second per second.
Artificial difficulty due to pumping the health and damage of what should otherwise be mini-bosses, and by reducing the leeway you might have on bosses' attacks by making attacks that take up nearly the entirety of your iframes within a roll. This obsession with a single quality of Elden Ring's base game design has come at the cost of so many other crucial, exemplary design choices which have been damaged significantly in this content, such as reducing the value of a jumpable move from a high-skill option that allows you to stay engaged while avoiding a boss's attack, and turning it into the only means of avoiding a contrived barrage of nonsense that forces you to disengage at best. And that's really the best way to describe the difficulty of this DLC.
Nice no hit.
It's contrived. If you're really telling me that the only way you could make a hard final boss was to implement an undodgeable move and by filling the arena with holy projectiles, then you shouldn't be making boss fights anymore. A great boss fight should look like a duel between two warriors, and should make you feel like you're dancing in between the boss's attacks, not jamming yourself into the dude's nutsack because the twink on his back is trying to hit you with the power of Christ. Lothric and Lorien did this shit 1,000 times better.
Amen.
Without contrived difficulty. I don't even really like that fight. I hate teleporting bosses. However, it is undeniably a better and more interesting design choice to make each brother have their own health bar, with the Necromancer being your main target. The skill set of positioning is natural.
That's like my favorite boss in Dark Souls 3, so I mean, at least he's being objective about it to an extent.
Developed within that fight because you'll get much more value from attacking Lorien directly, rather than an absolutely contrived line of holy projectiles falling after each attack. And so, with difficulty out of the way, let's move on to exploration.
Whew. Yeah, we were on difficulty for that long. Wow, we've been at that for 26 minutes of total runtime on this video. Dang. This video is going to take forever to upload. It's already an hour and 15 minutes long, dude. Jeez. If you're still here, thank you. I appreciate your existence. The exploration, to be honest, is one of my biggest complaints for various reasons. If the bosses were hard, but you could also find a crap ton of Erdtree fragments in reasonable places, that would be fine. But you can't, so let's see what he says about it.
I think at this point I've let slip enough how I'm feeling about this content that you should probably guess where I'm going with this.
Yeah,
the world bosses are mostly reused bosses from the main game or reskins. The worst example of this is probably the Hinterlands, which greets you with a Tree Sentinel, followed by a Tree Sentinel, and followed by a falling Star Beast. Yep. The funny thing about the Tree Sentinels being reused here is that we already have every piece of the Tree Sentinel's kit unlocked in the main game except for his horse, and so the reward for these fights are 2 bottles of Marika Bathwater, a reskin of the Divine Blessing from Dark Souls. The rest of the new mini-bosses are going to be found in minor dungeons, of which there are only 11 in the whole DLC. However, the new category of Forge Miner dungeons don't even have a boss fight. They
Yeah,
have
that
a
was always
weapon
weird.
to pull out of a forge as a main reward. The new bosses throughout the rest of
They're
the Miner
cool,
dungeons include Death Knights, Demi-Human Swordmasters, Chief Blood Fiend, a Cursed Blade, and Inquisitor Jory. As well as that, there's the two new forms made into PvP-style boss fights with the Lamenter and the Dragon Man. It is wholly clear to me that boss fights were not being prioritized when creating the exploratory content of this DLC. And that feels like such a fucking misread of what Elden Ring is supposed to be. Pulling some random weapon out of a forge is unfathomably less satisfying than it dropping as a reward from a boss fight, even if that boss fight isn't the best fight in the game. I find it baffling that loot was prioritized over gameplay in the explorative content, and especially so when considering that you're basically guaranteed to enter the DLC with a fully built character. It would be one thing if you could spawn in the DLC on a fresh new game, which would make every piece of loot that much more valuable to you. However, with a full kit, every loot drop either exists as something starkly powerful, enough so that you'll go out of your way to implement it into your rotation of weapons, or it's just garbage that you'll never equip. It would be kind of like if the main game's character select screen included fully leveled characters, such as the Azure Comet build, dual Katana Bleed build, full heavy armor Great Shield build, and so on. Why would you feel the need to explore if most of what you're going to loot is much worse than what you already have?
That is a good point. I think it is mostly the excitement of trying new weapons, but at the same time, he's right, because if you're already kitted out, you don't want to run the gamble on leveling up a new weapon. Of course, I guess if you've beaten every boss at that point, it wouldn't kill you to just level up these weapons, but I can see where he's going with this. He's also still not wrong. But it's not like other DLCs really did this either. I don't know where he's getting this idea of starting the DLC in, like, near the beginning of the game. From Software never really did that. In Dark Souls 2, you could access the DLC about mid-game-ish. Dark Souls 1, No, you couldn't access it early in Dark Souls 1. You had to wait till endgame. So, I don't know where he keeps getting this idea of, like, starting it in the middle somewhere. Excuse me. It would make more sense in an open world for it to be that way, but again, I think the level of like, really specific pacing that he wants would be near impossible to accomplish.
DLC is structured even worse than that because most of us were going in with characters we've played the entire game with, and therefore collected almost all the items. So the DLC's world is fleshed out with a bunch of loot I don't care about except for a few things, a bunch of crafting materials, a bunch of crafting books, and very few bosses, almost none of which are new. How the fuck am I supposed to feel inclined to explore this world? FromSoft's answer to the predicament of attempting to simulate a level of progression tied to your exploration of this world was the implementation of the Erdtree fragments, which are infinitely less immersive than the main game's massive list of loot, levels, NPCs, and challenges to overcome, all of which contribute to an increase in your overall power and ability.
I will say, the Erdtree fragments, not the worst system in the world, but getting them more than once is the most painful thing ever. I understand they were in kind of a tough position with the Erdtree fragments. Like, the way I thought they could have done it was starting your level over in a way, but like having them scale higher and they only apply when you're in the world. Almost like you're on a new level set, but just for the DLC. There's a lot of details to how that would or would not work. I don't know. I've seen it done before in some games, where like you switch to a different world and you're like on a different, like you're like on a new set of levels, like character levels, not like environment levels.
Abilities.
Weird
Instead
idea.
of, say, finding powerful talismans that can increase your damage by X amount in specific scenarios, you just gather a bunch of these pieces of bark, and you're permanently more powerful. Instead of finding a powerful weapon, collecting the resources to upgrade it, and gathering runes to meet its stat requirements, you just find bark, and then eat it, I guess. It's really entirely nebulous because it's a game mechanic first and foremost and not a real part of this world. Reduce every rewarding and immersive aspect of adventuring and exploring into a single item you'll have to hunt down throughout the whole map, and your result is a massive map that feels like an obligation to explore rather than inspiring you to adventure through it with natural excitement. For me, this expansion felt a lot like a checklist of areas to clear for the sake of having appropriate damage on bosses, and that's such a fucking sad statement to make about Elden Ring's content.
That is
and what's
true.
even more sad is to realize what a relief it is that you'll keep the Erdtree fragments you've collected when you go into New Game Plus.
He got me. Yeah, I was so happy that they transferred over. So happy. And if you were missing any, you could just get the early ones over again and apply those to get to your max 20 level. That does actually say quite a lot whenever how like you relieved you are that you get to keep them. Oh goodness, you got me.
Which brings me to my next point.
Replayability. Yeah.
After starting a New Game Plus and approaching the DLC with a fully...
Before he continues, what I did when I hit New Game Plus, boss. I did the same trainer quest line because I was curious. End game. I did not explore any of the areas again. I did not do any of the optional fights. I just did required bosses. Maybe did like a quest line or something I didn't do before, like getting to Mateer, and that was it. That is all I did. I did not feel like going through this world again. I did not want to. So let's see what he has to say about it.
Leveled Bark Blessing character. You're given the unique position of insight to decide exactly which parts of the realm of shadow you'll replay purely for the experience itself. You'll have nothing really to gain at that point, having looted everything of value and having reached the power caps of full Scadutree fragments and level hard caps, and you'll have the opportunity to see exactly how much of the content is worth actually playing. And so let's take a look at this massive map and dissect it a bit. And keep in mind I'll be looking at this through a subjective lens to describe how I feel about this content. First of all, we can completely cross out both the blue and red flower areas in the southern sections of the map. I really don't feel all that inclined to go well out of my way to fight the Putrescent Knight, and both of these sections are filled with reskin base game bosses.
Not only that, getting to the Putrescent Knight is freaking annoying. So yeah, I usually don't either.
I can say the exact same thing about the Jagged Peak, which features 2 Drake fights and an Ancient Dragon fight. This leaves the peak as a single linear path to sprint through as fast as possible to get to Bale, one of the few decent fights that I would probably go out of my way to do. From the starting area, we have the Bellarat Tower, a half-decent legacy dungeon with one of the worst bosses in all of Elden Ring at its end. An easy skip. Well then, we can take on Castle Ensis instead, a tiny legacy dungeon with a single linear path ending in the Rilana fight. As I've said, I get pretty bored of this boss's moveset by the end of her fight, so more often than not, I'll just skip the dungeon and go around the side area. From here, we can either enter the Shadow Keep from the front or side, and if we choose the front, we're greeted by the Golden Hippo fight. This is an obnoxious mini-boss whose grab hitbox was just nerfed and entirely relies on the same style of difficulty as the Dancing Lion fight. It only attacks with its head and therefore has unnatural telegraphs that are difficult to distinguish from basic movements.
Again, I guess I'm skill issue because I've tried to dodge that thing so many times. I think I pulled it off successfully like twice. I don't remember if I was on light load. Just saving another video.
And then you hit Phase 2, where you'll be pelted by an unnecessary amount of projectiles on each of its special moves. This fight is an easy pass, so we'll head through the side path, which first will bring us near the Manus Cathedral, which sends us along the quest toward Mateer. This quest only features visits to 2 incredibly massive yet incomprehensibly useless areas of the map. Both of the Finger Ruins are worthless wastes of assets and only offer you a source of crafting material for items you'll never
and lore. And that's it.
Craft, and are the only areas featuring the lamprey enemies. These dudes feel so out of place here and don't really have any other presence in the rest of the DLC, in the lore, or in Elden Ring at all. Overall, this whole quest is just to fight Mateer, a fight that wasn't too bad, but I doubt I would go out of my way for. And so let's just cross out both of the Finger Ruins as well as the Hinterland section leading up to the second Ruins, which only features base game bosses. Next we'll enter the Church District in an effort to get to the Shadow Keep, but be met with the decision of whether or not we'll want to fight the Scadutree Avatar. And I think this one is a big toss-up. This fight is pretty mid as far as the fight itself goes, and I think the fact that I would only go out of my way to fight it out of respect for its aesthetics kind of says it all. The combat is pretty basic and often disrupted by event moves or the boss respawning, and the boss isn't blocking anything. The sad thing is, I don't even dislike this fight at all. I just absolutely wouldn't go out of my way to fight it. If it was instead several world bosses, I would likely never skip one directly in my path. This is a huge issue of implementation that I've been referencing throughout this video. The boss's potential is wasted where it is, and so I'll regrettably say that I would skip this fight, just as I would Rilana. Commander Gaius is an easy skip, and I won't go into details on that one. But what about Midra? Obviously a skip, but let's talk about why. because this is...
I love the Midra fight. Getting to it, ugh. That whole area of the Abyssal Woods is terrible. Terrible, terrible, terrible. For once, I am in complete agreement with the community on something Souls-related. That whole area is stupid. There's, like, no good rewards in it whatsoever. It's literally just the mansion. Not being able to use Torrent is, like, the most useless, like, difficulty thing ever. As if exploring the mostly empty area on foot wasn't bad enough. Then they have these stupid, whatchamacallums, glowstone head guys walking around. That you only parry to kill. That whole Abyssal Woods section is awful. Awful, awful, awful. I usually kind of disagree with people about Elden Ring stuff, but man, I'm in complete agreement on that one. The Abyssal Woods are stupid. I get what they were going for, but they did it in the worst possible way. Absolute worst.
This is one of the most egregious waste of assets across the whole DLC. The process of reaching Midra requires finding a hidden coffin in the Shadowkeep, riding it into the moat drainage area, which features several furnace golems, easy skip, one of which you can apparently ignite by throwing a heavy flame pot into its head, but I never got it to work. Then you follow a ravine down a cliff and eventually into a minor dungeon, which features several lighting puzzles, a giant mouth imp, 3 different floors, and ends in a gank fight, which rivals the
gank fight's kind of
duo
annoying
in terms of gankiness and unsatisfying gameplay. After overcoming the dungeon, you're free to enter the Abyssal Woods, a frenzy-flamed themed area that just ends up looking like a Spirit Halloween store. Lo and behold, Torrent is too scared to be summoned within this area. Now forget the fact that Torrent has been our unwavering, faithful steed throughout swamps of rot, in fights with dragons of all kinds, and unfazed by the battle.
I heard the reason for this was because Frenzied Flame is basically the closest thing to permanent death in this world, and he's too scared of actually dying, so he doesn't want to come out and help.
Battle with Radahn. He's too scared of frenzy? Like madness buildup? Doesn't really make sense considering he's immune, so I guess he's afraid of the spooky Halloween woods. That's fucking weird. What's even weirder is the many developer messages written throughout this area, which really makes this content feel like a Roblox or Overwatch custom game, where the rules have to be written for you because it's not something you would expect out of the base game, such as the stealth minigame you're forced into with the reintroduction of winter lanterns.
Ouch.
Now, I would absolutely have no problem with these enemies if they could be implemented in a natural
Are Winter Lanterns a Bloodborne thing? It sounds like it.
Immersive way, but I think the messages on the ground here pretty much speak for themselves. This content is strange and disjointed from the main game in such a jarring way. We're forced off our mounts due to contrivance and then funneled into these enemies that only amount to crouching for a while or parrying each one of them. What the fuck is this entire area?
Yeah,
the woods section is massive, bare bones, and empty, with random pointless pieces of loot thrown in that are never worth the run back.
Nope,
and
never.
3 total enemies, rats, inquisitors, and winter lanterns. This whole woods area should have been considered part of the legacy dungeon, and therefore should have had an interesting layout with twists and turns that take you through the many different set pieces that mesh well together. Instead, we get a giant lump of spooky themed nothing, and the cherry on top, you'll have to walk through it on foot. And after a secret coffin shortcut, a ravine path, a large minor dungeon, and a 5k through the woods, we still haven't reached the legacy dungeon. Midra's Manse is embarrassingly small, and only amounts to a linear path you'll sprint through while periodically pulling levers. And even on your first playthrough here, you'll find very little of value to you. The majority of items here are Frenzied Flame related, one of the worst status effects. Even if Midra was the greatest fight in the DLC, getting to him would be a pain in the ass, on a similar level to reaching Millennia. But the fact is, he's not named Midra for nothing. He's a glorified mini-boss and the easiest skip so far. And that leaves us...
Millennia... She is pretty annoying to get to. But like you said, there are way more like worthwhile rewards, bosses to fight, things along those lines. So I hate to say it, I do skip Midra, aside from the brain reset. I have to admit, I also skip Midra just because pretty much exactly what he just said. It's such a time waste. I do have a mod in Elden Ring that lets me just replay bosses when I feel like it, but
with the final stretch of the main playthrough of the DLC. Mesmer is incredible, and I might have to fight him on a higher new game or lower level so as to avoid breezing through him the next time I fight him. Radahn is an obvious pass, so we'll cross out Inner Ilum, and if there's no progression-based rewards for beating Romana, then I'll once again regrettably pass on her too. Getting to her requires navigating through the Shadowkeep and past the Pyromancer's Bridge, only to end up in the confusing, convoluted ruins area. Sadly, it's a pass. And so what am I left with on a replay of this content? A straight shot through to Bale and then Mesmer, and that's it. To me, everything else isn't...
That is very subjective, and, he can have that opinion. I don't think it's quite that bad, but I get where he's coming from.
Worth my time on a casual New Game Plus playthrough, and that is a tragedy. All of this leaves me with a single conclusion about the contents in Shadow of the Erdtree.
See, at least in Dark Souls 1, the map was linear. You didn't really... there was a lot of exploring you could do in the level, but, if you wanted to rush through it, it didn't, stop you from that, because the level literally was just linear. Boss, the forest area, Artorias, the township, Manus. 1, 2, 3, and if you want to fight Calamite, 4. It's, just off the path. Right.
Tree. A useless conclusion that doesn't change anything.
Yeah, what do you say?
Through. And that is a tragedy. All of this leaves me with a single conclusion about the contents in Shadow of the Erdtree. A useless conclusion that doesn't change anything. Shadow of the Erdtree should have been a sequel, not a DLC. Of course, this would require several more years of development to extend the map, flesh out what we have, and find appropriate places to reuse assets instead of sequestering half-assed fights into the role of remembrance. But just look at what the content of this DLC was focused on. Innovating the weapon system by adding new types of weapons. Cool. Innovating the difficulty by making boss moves less forgiving. Innovating the combat by adding the deflection tier and backstep iframes through new talismans. Innovation is the exact quality that you would expect from a sequel, which would tread the lines between offering something new while not getting too far away from what worked in the first place. Refinement is what you would want and expect from a DLC, which is a concept that this content is sorely lacking in.
I see what he's saying. It's like they're trying to reinvent the wheel, even though it's just DLC for a game that already tried to reinvent the wheel. See, I see what he's saying.
Already have the road paved, the weapons designed, the combat ironed out, the world built, the basic systems in place like bonfires, weapon upgrades, leveling, consumables. When making a DLC, all you have to do is create the most refined concept of content that you can within the game you've already built. Not throw a bunch of new, weird, half-baked ideas that may or may not jive with the rest of the base game concepts. This content is 100% focused on innovation despite still being attached to Elden Ring.
And I have a theory about all of this, so you should subscribe to see that video come out in the future.
And now the base game's content's meta is getting brutalized by a barrage of innovations that it wasn't built to facilitate.
That doesn't matter. You don't have to use this new stuff. Don't worry about that crap. That's blaming the DLC for making the base game easier is just stupid because you've already borderline beaten the base game by this point, so that's just stupid.
On top of that, the DLC's content is also hurt by being attached to Elden Ring for some obvious reasons. If you wish to play the DLC content again, even if you use a New Game Plus and don't have to hunt for weapons or upgrades, it takes around 40 minutes at best to complete the intro, get your horse, get to Altus, get to Caelid, beat Radahn, start Vare's quest, get to the Belfry, soak your sheet in Maiden's Blood, return to Vare, kill the invader in Altus, get your ride to Mogwyn, complete Mogwyn, and beat Mohg. All of that just to enter this massive world, only to realize there's very little replayability in this massive world. So you'll do 2 fights and then leave. If this content wasn't piggybacking off of Elden Ring's base game and was a standalone sequel, you could instead start as a level 1 in Mogwyn's Palace, beat some new intro boss in Mohg's Arena, and then be off into the DLC. You would have a fresh start and everything would be valuable to you, including the many weapons, rune drops, upgrade materials, every crafting book, and resource. It would be just like Elden Ring's original release, and therefore you wouldn't need the contrived and largely disliked Erdtree frag.
Because I'm not saying that the idea of putting the DLC earlier in the main game's path is a bad idea. It's just the way he was describing it be done sounded so convoluted and a bit unrealistic to expect for DLC.
And system of progression. The various challenges throughout this world could have been balanced to the level you would be expected to fight them at, which would create a natural scale of progression, again just like the main game. Lastly, killing Mohg and Radahn were made to be mandatory events that you must complete before gaining access to the DLC, so that their stories could be chronologically accurate. This leads the DLC to be placed in a very inconvenient near endgame position, and with that in mind, I think it's clear but frustrating as to why we didn't get a single drop of Melina or Godwyn lore in this content. For Melina's story to be progressed, this would require first burning the Erdtree, in order to keep a chronologically accurate depiction of events in Shadow of the Erdtree. This would also disqualify anyone who was playing a Lord of Frenzied Flame playthrough, as the events would then play out differently. In the same way, if Godwyn were to appear in a meaningful way in the DLC, you would likely have to play through Fia's questline first. And so, FromSoft seems to have been in the position where they could either have a fully fleshed out DLC that tackles many players in this world but requires beating most of the content in the base game, or cutting everyone less important to the single main storyline of the DLC so that only Radahn and Mohg had to be beaten. And at some fucking point, someone should have said, if the continuation of this story requires taking place after the events of most of the main game, then why don't we just do that and make a full sequel? At some...
Good point. Good point. That actually does make a lot of sense. If you have to beat the majority of the base game anyways for a more interesting DLC story to take place, just make a sequel. That's not how games often do it, because a lot of games that do that aren't open world. They usually have like a menu in the menu that says, hey, access the DLC here, and when you press on it, it says, hey, have you beaten the base game? This is a sequel to the base game. And if you do know how the base game ends, you click yes, I'm aware, go through. But Elden Ring's open world, and it's so interconnected, that's kind of hard to do. You can't really do that. So, like I said, FromSoft had a really big conundrum here. People want DLC so badly that I think they made a lot of mistakes in here. Again, I will make a video on that someday.
At one point, someone should have said, if we're making a giant massive map which we'll need to fill with meaningful loot, then why don't we delay it and make it a full sequel? Someone should have said, if we're making all kinds...
Make like a Far Cry New Dawn spin-off, right? Make it $40 instead of 60. The map size can stay the same, but just make it better. Right.
Of new weapon classes, implementing Sekiro deflections and iframe backsteps. Why don't we fine-tune the combat engine a bit and just make a fucking sequel? This is a tragedy every way you look at it, because the amount of content is huge for a DLC. One of the biggest content drops in gaming history. Yet I would describe it as mostly half-baked. This is way more than $40 worth of ingredients.
Absolutely.
But it was served to us fucking raw. And I think the saddest part of all of this is that this might be the very last bit of Elden Ring content that we will ever see. There are rumors going around that FromSoft won't be working on projects as large-scale as Elden Ring in the future.
I don't know if FromSoft had made the statement yet by the time this video was uploaded, as you can see, July 11th. I don't know if FromSoft had made the statement yet, but that's not a rumor. That's literally just a fact. They're not going to make a game as big as Elden Ring, at least not for a long time. They're going to scale down a little bit. Good move. Good move. But I see what he's saying.
Sure. And the fact that this content has mixed reviews on Steam might be the nail in the coffin. So many people put so much time into creating the Shadow of the Erdtree, and I for one would easily give it a negative review, and that is by no means the fault of the project's scale or the ground level developers breaking their backs to build the many pieces that came together to create this world.
Absolutely.
I 100% place the blame on a lack of direction and vision. If
Agreed.
you think undodgeable boss moves are good enough, you shouldn't be making bosses. If you think that Erdtree fragments are good enough to replace every system of progression in the main game, you shouldn't be designing balancing systems. If you think that an environment unfriendly towards casuals is an appropriate setting for your fucking Elden Ring content, then you don't understand your own fanbase. Above all else,
Elden Ring casuals, right? Not casual gamers. Because casual gamers don't beat Elden Ring in the first place, right? I think that was something he probably should have clarified on a little bit.
Else, if you fail to recognize that this content sucks as a DLC and yet has all the potential in the world as a sequel, then you shouldn't have been a creative director on this project. And that failure has led to countless hours of effort and development to amount to nothing but a mixed review on Steam. A rating that I would argue is too high and is largely propped up by mindless get-good drones who choose to be ignorant to the failures of this content.
I don't agree with that. I understand. I think mixed is a good... That's the problem. It's relative, right? Saying that a game is mixed on Steam says a lot more than saying this DLC has mixed reviews on Steam. That's a completely different statement. It's relative to the game. I don't agree with that, because if you were to take how most gamers play games, one time through, you're done with it. Maybe you'll play it in like 3 years in the future or something. It's absolutely worth it, 100%. Play it, go through the content. You'll be frustrated, but you got what you paid for, right? There's a lot of content in here. But, relatively speaking, the content is extremely unsatisfying. So, I don't think it should have been lower than mixed. I think mixed makes sense. FromSoft fans might not be happy with it. Casuals might just play it and move along. Some people may love it. You know, it's weird. There are objective shortcomings, but I don't think it should have been lower than mixed. I think that kind of rings hollow.
This content drop was easily a worst-case scenario for Elden Ring fans.
No, that's just wrong. Oh, you sweet summer child. Absolutely not. The worst-case scenario would have been that this DLC was insanely boring, way too easy. The loot didn't mean anything because the content was too easy. We got just as much empty stuff, just as much meaningless loot. The bosses, instead of being really annoying, were just super stupidly simple. Oh goodness, and the lore makes even less sense. I don't care about the lore, so... Or hey, maybe it could have been harder to access. Or, like he said, maybe you have to have a DLC or an NPC alive, or you have to do their quest first. So yeah, like, this was not the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario could have also been, hey, they changed the leveling system from base game to DLC to be something even more dumb than finding scattered tree fragments. No, that's a completely rage-induced take. That is not true at all. This was not the worst case scenario. Not even close. Not even close.
We didn't and will never get a true DLC that refines what worked about Elden Ring to its most perfected form. And we will likely never get a sequel, as all of the remaining lore has been pilfered through for its most important parts, leaving Melina, Godwyn, the Gloam-Eyed Queen, and every other unanswered question on the cutting room floor. This is it. And if that statement doesn't leave a depressed pit in your stomach, then I envy you.
Bag fumbled. That's a weird text.
So how did this happen? How did one of the industry-leading developers with one of the most popular games of the last decade fumble this hard at such an important juncture? I don't really have an answer for you.
I do have an answer.
All I can do is speculate, and my speculation comes down to two options. The first...
I'm going to stop it there, because that's my own video. I don't want him putting ideas in my head. So, that was Jester of Juice's video. Really well-made video. I'll leave a like. I mean, I guess it wasn't really well made. It was literally just him slapping his no-hit footage on the screen over and over again. I agree with a lot of what he said. I think he went a bit extreme on some cases, but there was also a comment I wanted to look at. Right down here. You may not be able to see it very well, but... It says, I think this DLC showed that the basic Dark Souls combat system has been stretched to the point of breaking. They have to finally let go of it, or accept that they hit the limit of difficulty in their games, and focus on something else. Best comment in this whole comment section. That is... peak 100%. There are also videos made about that. Like, they can't do this again. The difficulty has been stretched so far thin, they cannot make a game like Elden Ring again, or else it'll be too easy in comparison. So they have to do something more similar to Bloodborne or Sekiro, Armored Core, etc., etc. A lot of people are speculating, what could that game be? We don't know. That's gonna do it for me. This was an hour and 40 plus minutes long. Holy guacamole. I have to edit this. I have to edit this. Anyways, that is my video reacting to Jester of Juice. It was a well-made video, all things considering, but like his dialogue was good, etc., etc. So thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe. I love doing this. I love talking about Elden Ring, Dark Souls, all those games. And I will see you next time. Don't you dare go hollow.